So I am going to be recording this. The participants, you're all muted anyway, but the panelists have agreed to be recorded, and we're going to be posting this on our website sometime probably within the week. So welcome to our webinar on the ethics of nonprofit news, what board members and donors need to know. My name is Dan Kennedy, and I'm a professor in the School of Journalism at Northeastern University. Along with my research and podcast partner, Ellen Clegg, I also run What Works, the Future of Local News, a project that's part of our journalism program, and we're also affiliated with the Center for Transformative Media. For the next hour and 15 minutes or so, we're going to talk with leaders in nonprofit news about what ethical considerations publishers, board members, and donors should keep in mind. Our conversation will be specially geared toward hyperlocal startups, but we hope that what we hear will have broader applications as well. Now, some housekeeping. We've turned off the sound except for our panelists, but we welcome your questions in the chat, which is being monitored by Ellen. We'll get to as many as we can starting around 7:45. We'll go till about 8:15. And as I said, we're also recording this and we'll be posting it at whatworks.news in the next few days. With that, let me begin with our first guest. Josh Stearns is Managing Director of Programs at the Democracy Fund and is a longtime activist on issues related to media reform and equitable journalism. He's also held leadership positions at the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation and Free Press, a media reform organization that's based in Northampton, Massachusetts. Now, Josh, I'm starting with you because I want you to set the agenda for our discussion. Folks who start nonprofit community news projects often have little background in how to think about journalism ethics, conflicts of interest, how to build relationships with funders based on mutual respect, and what lines, if any, do board members need to respect. So take it away.
That's great, Dan. Thanks so much. I'll offer two other pieces of context just to frame up some of the remarks I make. When I was at the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation, my primary role was actually coaching local news organizations and local news startups and really working with them to develop revenue models and sustainability strategies. And so while I haven't been in the news startup game myself, I've done a lot of work with news entrepreneurs and just have enormous respect for the board members and journalists and publishers who are getting these things off the ground. I'll also share that in addition to being a funder for the last 9 years, I've run the Public Square program at Democracy Fund, which is our journalism and technology grant making program. I also sit on the board of Honolulu Civil Beat, which is a nonprofit newsroom based in Honolulu, Hawaii. So I'm wearing both board member hats, funder hats, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So when I think about these things, I'll give a kind of top line of a couple of the things that I think about for each in the foundations and the board member categories. And then we will dig into all of these in much more detail with the amazing panelists that we have here today. So first of all, from a funder's point of view, there was a lot of really great work done around 2016, 2015 with the American Press Institute, who created a whole framework and guide for ethical behavior of funders who are funding nonprofit journalism. And their work was sort of the first time that people had tried to set some ethical guidelines for people who fund journalism. There's a lot of richness there. I'm going to do some sort of top line uh, sort of takeaways from that work, and we'll put a link to everything there. But I think, first of all, one of the things I think about with funders is a kind of principle like the Hippocratic Oath, which is, do no harm. And I think that one of the things, even well intended, sometimes funders who don't understand journalism can sometimes operate in a way that can really hurt a growing new startup or constrain a growing new startup or interfere with ethics, especially at the local level when we have board members who may also be deeply entwined with community members and community organizations. So I like to remind people to do no harm, and we can unpack that later, all the different ways that that might show up. Um, Another piece that I think of from funders is to, whenever possible, take proactive steps to ensure the independence of the journalism that you're funding. And so for us at Democracy Fund, whenever we put funding into a newsroom, we actually have a clause in our grant agreement with that newsroom that we will not discuss editorial topics with that newsroom. We will not discuss any stories in the works, anything coming up to be published. Obviously, after the story is published, we're interested to know what happened because of it and the outcomes of it and that sort of thing. But that's a contractual agreement that we make with our grantees not to discuss editorial issues with the grantee. It's just a proactive step that we can take to help with editorial independence and I think there's a lot of other things that we can do as funders to be attentive to those things. Then the last thing I would say is, whenever possible, funders should think about funding journalism with general operating grants. That's not always a possibility, but whenever possible, being able to maximize flexibility for news organizations and ensure that news organizations can apply that funding in a variety of different ways, especially for growing organizations that are facing uncertain and unprecedented circumstances, being able to have the flexibility of that funding is really key. So, from a board member point of view, I think of three other things. So, one, um, somebody once said to me, board members should think about their role as nose in and fingers out. So I've always really liked that. The idea you should be able to, as a board member, you should be sniffing around and making sure that everything smells right and everything's going well. You have a governance and fiduciary responsibility to this organization's health, and you need to be attentive to that. But keeping your nose in, maybe keep your hands behind your back so you're not meddling in the details. I share that acknowledging that also boards and organizations come in all shapes and sizes. Some boards are roll up your sleeves, digging into the work with the organization, really helping operate. And those operational boards that are full of volunteers that are helping make the organization run, that's going to look a little different. You're going to necessarily have your fingers in the work in a way, hopefully, that's really supportive. But I think knowing the kind of organization you're in, the expectations of your publisher or executive director, and having real clear communication about that's important. The other thing I would say is be thinking deeply about your governance and how an organization is governed really matters. We've seen really amazing organizations collapse because of governance issues at the board level. And so getting good and practicing good governance, and there's lots of resources which I can post about that as well, is something that's really worth paying attention to. And then the last thing I would say is funding. Not every board is a funding board that either gives massively itself or helps raise money, but even just small ways that board members can help lift the financial situation of an organization, helping support fundraising, helping talk to other donors in your networks, and showing that you back the organization in some way too, is a really powerful signal to other people. So there's lots of other roles and ethical considerations for boards and funders, but I'll leave it at that as a starting place.
Okay, that's terrific, Judge. Thank you so much. Our next panelist is Kara Myberg Guzman, who is the co-founder and CEO of Santa Cruz Local, a nonprofit news organization in California that's focused on communities not otherwise served by local media. Her mission is to provide fair, accurate, and reliable news that's free and accessible to all residents. She's also a board member of the Tiny News Collective, whose mission is to make journalism entrepreneurship accessible, equitable, and inclusive. Now, Kara, Santa Cruz Local was originally a for-profit outlet. At some point, you and your business partner, Stephen Baxter, decided to reorganize the local as a nonprofit. Could you tell us why you did that? And you've told me that moving to nonprofit status led you to draft a new ethics policy. Could you tell us what that process was like? What ethical considerations did you have to address that were different from those you were operating under as a for-profit?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Dan, for that intro. I I'll try not to bury the lead here, which I think is uh, 501(c)(3) status is not a business model. It's also not a signal of your values and ethics. You can be There are a lot of for-profit organizations, news organizations that have, a mission, values, and funding models of traditionally nonprofit news organizations. That was the case with us when we launched in 2019. I had just left a hedge fund owned newspaper as their managing editor, and I really wanted to start a news organization to serve my community. We didn't have any startup capital beyond what was in our back pockets. And we had to start really light and really small and with a lot of experimentation to see what sticks. So we launched as a for-profit because it was the quickest, fastest, lightest thing to start. You can look up how to how to launch an LLC for dummies at the library, and that's what we did. You can start an LLC in a day versus a nonprofit, which takes a much longer time, to form a board, fill out the application, get it through the IRS. An LLC was just a lot quicker and lighter. From the start, we've always done this as a public service to our community. We've always been primarily funded by individual donors. We decided after a couple years with a fiscal sponsor, we decided to just move all the way to 501(c)(3) status because we were getting more and more major gifts of $5,000 and more. And rather than give a cut to our fiscal sponsor, which was raising its rates, we decided to just become a full nonprofit. Like I said, so when you become a nonprofit newsroom, it makes it easier for donors to give. It also moves decision-making power to a volunteer board. And it also limits the kind of news that you can do, especially around elections. Like you can't do any editorials that are weighing in on that promote or oppose a candidate. Since day one, we've always done like that kind of journalism. We've never done any endorsements around elections. So when we became a nonprofit, we had to sort of codify those things in a editorial and transparency policy. There are a lot of models out there. What we did was use the Institute for Nonprofit News's template as a starting point. And then, it just gave us the language that we needed, and then we adjusted it based on what we the priorities we had especially around donor transparency, which I'd love to get into a little bit more later. But those are the basics of how we got started as a nonprofit.
Okay, terrific. And then our third panelist tonight is Joe Kriesberg, who's the CEO of the Massachusetts Institute for a New Commonwealth, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to economic opportunity and civic vitality. In that capacity, Joe serves as publisher of Commonwealth Beacon, which is MassInc's digital publication covering state politics and public policy. Joe also has decades of experience in nonprofit management, and before coming to MassInc, was president and CEO of the Massachusetts Association of Community Development Corporations. Now, given that this is a webinar about ethics and we're being very transparent, I'm also on the advisory board for Commonwealth Beacon. I just wanted to mention that. So, Joe, my question for you is what have you observed about the challenges of dealing with board members and donors at a nonprofit news organization? In what ways is that similar to or different from that's weird. Okay. I'm sorry. Zoom just gave me a message that I wasn't sure what to do with. I hope we're all good. Um, in what ways is dealing with a nonprofit news organization similar or different from running a nonprofit that's not involved in news? Have you found that there are ethical considerations with regard to journalism that you need to keep in mind that weren't an issue in your previous career? And for that matter, I think that in the news business, we're always looking for new and good ideas. What do you think nonprofit news leaders could learn from the nonprofit world more broadly?
Well, that's a lot. Well, good evening, everybody. And Dan, thanks for having me. I guess in full transparency, I used to watch Dan on TV in my kitchen almost every Friday night on Beat the Press. So, and now we get to work together, which is exciting for me. So for those who don't know, community development corporations are community-based nonprofits working to expand economic opportunity in usually at a neighborhood level, but sometimes at a municipal or regional level. And we were their trade association. And so community development corporations have some similarities to a hyperlocal news organization. They're about cultivating and building communities, civic participation, small d democracy. And they also have some of the same kind of dynamics of everybody knows everybody, everybody's in everybody's business. You see people at the grocery store, you see people walking down the street. There's a level of accountability that comes from that that can complicate issues like nonprofit governance and independence. So I do think there's a lot of similarities, and that's a movement that's been around for 40 or 50 years. So there's some lessons from that field, I think, that do carry over. And one of those is the importance of a mission to anchoring any nonprofit organization. We say nonprofit, which we sort of define ourselves by what we're not. We're not a private company. And in other contexts, we say non-governmental because we're not the government. But what are we actually? We are mission-driven organizations, and mission has to be our North Star at all times. And I feel very strongly about that. People have to understand what the mission is and what it means to the organization, because all nonprofits, news organizations, or any are constantly faced with choices about how to spend time, what to do, and in particular, what to do in response to a funding opportunity. And in my old world, we had a term, I didn't make this up, somebody else did, but a vendorism, where a nonprofit begins to think of itself as a vendor who is here to serve donors by helping donors achieve the objectives of the donor. So foundation puts out a funding opportunity. We're looking for nonprofits that can help educate kids who are falling behind in reading, ages 8 to 12, whatever it is. And now you as a nonprofit have to sort of say, well, we can deliver that outcome for you, funder. And many nonprofits have to play that game to survive, but it's a dangerous game because you can lose sight of your mission and start seeing yourselves as the delivery system or the vendor for philanthropy. And I even wrote an article about this years ago, I think published in a nonprofit news publication, about this tension between what I called supply side and demand side nonprofit work, whereas demand side is, at least in the community development space, our job was to go out in the community, find out what the community members wanted, try to formulate that into an actionable strategy, and then go convince the powers that be to support that agenda. Supply side is, what does the donor, what does the government want to do? What does a foundation or corporation want to do? And then we'll do what they want to do so we can get their money. And this really got brought home to me one day when I was meeting with a very high level official or working for our governor, lobbying for money for my members. And she quite directly said, listen, you want money for your members so they can do what they want to do. But if I'm going to give you money, I want them to do the things the governor wants to do, because it's my job to implement the governor's agenda. And I never had any government official say it to me so bluntly, but it was a great point, because she was doing her job and I was doing my job. And, my off-the-cuff response was, well, let's do the things we all want to do. There's a lot of overlap. And so, that did ultimately sort of where we landed. So mission, mission, mission. The second thing I want to say is, because I know when I got here at Commonwealth Beacon, we spent a lot of time writing up policies using the INN template, which was excellent. And we now have all the written policies on our website, none of which we had before. But we've always had here, long before I got here, a good culture when it came to this issue. The newsroom has always had total independence. The board members, other members of the staff, fundraising staff, and so understood that was their domain. So we had a really strong culture. We just didn't have anything written down. And if I had to choose between a good culture and lots of written policies, I'll take the culture every day. Because, this is somebody else's expression, but culture eats policy for lunch. It's really much more important. So that's another key thing. I do want to pick up on a couple of things that Josh said about governance in terms of organizational resilience. A lot of research has been done in the community development field about why do organizations fail. And in every single case, it's because the board failed. The board checked out. There was irreconcilable conflict on the board. There were two people on the board who claimed all the power and would never let go. And in neighborhoods, there can be sort of the town fathers and mothers who kind of control everything and know everybody, and they can kind of dominate a very local organization. So I think that's really important to have good governance to sustain yourself through the tough times, including staff turnover. And then on the general operating support, again, every nonprofit, journalism or not, wants general operating support. And I think many funders recognize this and look for organizations where there's broad alignment, and then invest and trust that nonprofit to know what to do. And, that's especially true, I think, in the journalism sector, but it's true across nonprofits. The last thing I'll say before I stop for now is, I think the big difference that I've struggled with in my job here compared to my other job is, I do think it's reasonable for funders to want to see outcomes from their money, want to see some positive change in the world. That's why they're giving it away. And when you're asking people to give money away, I think you need to be able to articulate why that'll make the world a better place, because there's other things they could give their money to. And it's really hard to promise outcomes for journalism. We know there are outcomes in a sort of conceptual way. And I think a lot of people in journalism, I found, don't take any offense, folks, just sort of assume, well, everybody knows journalism is good. Like, what else do they need to know? And so I think the question of how to articulate outcomes, how to articulate the theory of why our journalism will create a chain of events that will lead to a better society without promising that you're going to pass bills or create outcomes that reflect a bias in your journalism. I think that's the biggest challenge I've had, and I think is a big challenge for this field as we seek more philanthropic support.
Okay, terrific. That's really great. And I would like to now ask a few questions, and I would also say that this would be a good time for people to start putting questions in the chat as well. But let me begin by talking about conflicts of interest for board members. Now, in many communities, the most involved citizens are serving in all kinds of ways. They might be active in the Chamber of Commerce. They might be an elected official. They may be an appointed official. Now, we're here in New England, and there are some towns that have elected town meetings with many dozens of members. And if all of those people can't be involved in the local news organization, you're taking a lot of potential players off the board. So I'm going to ask you to draw lines in a few fuzzy ethical areas this evening. So let's start with that. What level of involvement in a community should present such a conflict that people should not serve as a board member of a nonprofit news organization? And we can just start with any of you. Tara, you're kind of on the ground, so maybe we could start with you.
Sure. Um, the only limit we have on our board is that uh, we don't seek elected officials to be on our board. And once you're on our board, you can't publicly endorse any local campaigns that we report on. You can't lead any like ballot measure signature gathering. You can't put yard signs up. Anything that has the appearance of a conflict of interest, because we report so heavily on elections, it just makes it a lot easier for us to keep people's trust if our board members stay, nonpartisan on local issues.
So essentially, it sounds like some of the same guidelines that you would have for your journalists.
Right, that just applies to our board as well. It's just a lot simpler.
Okay. Um,
Well,
Josh,
can I pick up on that?
yeah,
Just to
Joe,
say that we
please.
don't have that rule. We don't have any elected officials on our board, and we wouldn't. But we have former elected officials. We have prominent political actors. We have them from both political parties, and we make an intention of that. But many of the people on our board are active politically. And, I think that one of the things I think about is having an interest is not necessarily a conflict of interest, that there's a difference. And it's not always clear, it's fuzzy, but we drew it at elected officials. But beyond that, people are involved in civic life. That's great, as far as we're concerned.
What do you make of that, Josh? At the beginning of my career, I covered a community that had something like 170 elected town meeting members. And if you were going to apply the no elected officials rule in a community like that, that's an awful lot of people who can't get involved in your news organization. Any thoughts, Josh?
I mean, the thing that I come back to is something Kara said, which is it's hard to maintain trust if dot dot dot. And I think that in some ways is a starting place for me is if you know your community well enough and intimately enough, you know what their expectations, values, and norms might be. And that might guide how you think about sort of these interests or conflicts of interests. Um, in part because I really truly believe that different people and different communities operate with sort of different sets of expectations. And I don't say that as a cop out so much as I think grounding ourselves in community and thinking about what builds trust and what erodes trust. If you have a housing developer on your board and you are reporting on housing issues all the time, what do you need to do to prove to your readers that they can trust that reporting? It may be fine to have that board member on your board, but you may need to take extra steps around transparency or other things to manage that. And so I think in many ways that's what it comes down to. And I think the only other thing I would say is um, there's also an actions part of this too. I think any board member, you could have a board member who doesn't appear to have a conflict of interest, and then if they start putting pressure on an editor or a journalist, then you need to be ready to have a path that you can take to resolve that in ways that protect your independence too. So there is both where do you draw the lines up front, but also how do you prepare for situations that might come up in tight-knit communities where conflicts might arise in unexpected ways?
Now, there are some folks in the nonprofit space who argue that board members should have no role in news coverage beyond, say, sharing a story tip. But I've been reporting on nonprofit news for more than 15 years. And my experience is that at some very good nonprofits, board members are often a source of volunteer labor, even to the point of going out and doing stories. I'd like to hear from you as to which model you think works best. Is it a matter of size? Is there a gray area that you think exists somewhere between you should be hands-on or you should be hands-off? You have any board members itching to get out and cover a legislative hearing, Joe?
No, no, we don't have board members do any reporting by any stretch, but we have board members write op-eds for us on a regular basis, and certainly, pitch stories, and they're at liberty to do that. I tell them to talk to the editors, not the reporters, to provide a little bit, who have a little bit more self-confidence, maybe to say no or whatever. Believe me, my editors say no all the time, and I think some of it is, if we say the editors have independence and control, then act like we mean it, which means we're not afraid to, have board members interact with them because we actually mean it. The editors get to say no. And we have board members sign something, again, it's paperwork, but they sign a journalistic integrity statement so they understand, kind of what they can and can't do. So but we're a state organization. We're not hyper local. We're not sort of a volunteer driven thing.
Okay. Have you had to deal with that issue, Kara?
Um, so I serve on two boards. I'm actually a voting member of Santa Cruz Locals Board, even though I'm on staff. Here in California, you can have um, staff members on a not volunteer board as long as you're not the majority. um, I'm former board president of the Tiny News Collective. I'm still on the board there. Um, so with the Tiny News example, we were the board founded the nonprofit. It's a journalism support organization that helps entrepreneurs from underserved communities start newsrooms to serve their communities. We work with the very earliest stage news organizations. And at the very start, we were very much a working board. We were all volunteering. We were kind of like acting as staff members. Some of our board members were working like volunteering 20 to 30 hours a week, trying to get this off the ground, doing all the fundraising. And now the Tiny News Collective is a much more mature organization. We hired an executive director. We're building out our staff, and our board is transitioning from a working board to more of a governance board. So we're all of us on the board are kind of stepping back, and we're in this like transition phase. I think there's like stages to a nonprofit, and eventually you get to a point where I would think you like, depending on what you're trying to do, like, but eventually you get to a point where the volunteers are being or like the organization is powered by paid staff. Yeah, I have more to say, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Josh, anything to add to that?
No, I mean, my background before working with independent newsrooms and nonprofit newsrooms was in community media, and grassroots community media. Often the board, the content creators, like everyone was just rolling up their sleeves and making things work. And I think the thing that I saw in those situations, and I think that's relevant here too, is can you fulfill your governance and your fiduciary responsibility to the organization and be involved in those other ways? some boards really could. They could really have healthy board discussions about the organization's budget, finances, bylaws, staffing, etc., while also, contributing content or, hosting radio shows or whatever it might be. Other boards really couldn't, and they couldn't divorce their sort of volunteer work for the community media organization from what they need to do to govern the organization, and that can get really tricky. And so again, like a lot of it comes down to Joe. I think you were talking about ethics as and culture in a newsroom. I would say there's also culture issues that show up in boards as well.
Okay, great. Now, I do want to get in a question about funders. Then we'll open it up to the great questions that have been rolling. Let me ask you this. This is another gray area question. Hyperlocal projects in particular are mainly going to rely on local funders, community foundations, high net worth individuals, which I've learned is nonprofit speak for rich people, who want to support local news and the like. In some cases, a donor might give money for a specific coverage area, let's say the arts. I think we would all agree that presents no ethical dilemmas, but it would be completely out of line for a donor to push for coverage of a specific arts organization. So, is there a sweet spot between those two extremes? And is there a way to deal with a pushy donor without losing the money that they contribute?
I would my knee-jerk response is that money does not fall out of the sky, and typically it is there's a process as you're like building a relationship with a donor, getting to know them, and then you ask for a gift to support your mission, and then there's more relationship building after that. So it's like usually in the getting to know you process, you can tell pretty quickly if a donor is really mission and values and vision aligned with you. I've been in situations where, I'm getting to know a high net worth individual who's excited about our work, and but it becomes clear that they don't really understand the line. Like they'll be pushing for, like I'm really passionate about this thing. I'd love for you to report on this thing, and they see it as a more of a transactional thing, whereas it just doesn't fit with how we view the relationships with donors. So I usually try to educate them and let them know and push them and show them like this is where we see the line, but sometimes it doesn't work out, and then it's often well before the ask or before any money comes in that you can tell.
Joe, you said that you actually research prospective donors before you approach them. What are you looking for? What are the red lights that would be blinking that you say, I don't think I'm going to try to push this relationship?
I'm mostly looking for green lights, Dan.
Yes.
But I think that I suppose a prominent high net worth individual who was very sort of well known and famous for having very strong either left or right wing views, or was funding activities that were hardcore one way or the other, I might stay away from, just not a bother. But more what I'm looking for is, if I see they're very civically active in, say, education, and they really care about education policy, then I might, in talking to them, highlight our education coverage, something like that. Now, one of the things that I mentioned earlier, demand side, supply side, I think it's really different if a funder comes to you and says, I want you to fund education coverage, versus us deciding as part of our mission and strategy, geez, we're really weak on education coverage. It's an area where we don't have any reporters that are really strong or have history, and we're not really covering that as well as we'd like to. We want to expand our education coverage. Now we go out and look for people who might fund that. That feels very different because that's coming from the community or coming from our organization. It is driven by our sense of what we need to do to achieve our mission. And so I think which way the flow goes matters. One other thing I wanted to get in here too is that we're, a little bit larger maybe than some of the hyperlocal groups on the call. So we have a publisher, me, and an editor who's a separate person. And that creates some important buffer. I'm the one who's interacting with the donors most of the time. Now, we just hired a new editor, and I obviously wanted her to meet the donors and vice versa. And so we've had some coffees and we have some meetings like that. But I'm the one making the ask. I'm the one negotiating the relationship. It's a little easier for me to create some buffer. And just as an example, the other day, I got an email from one of our biggest donors saying, that was a really nice article. I was glad to see it. And I did not share it with the editor. I thought that was weird. Like, why wouldn't I want to pat the editor on the back? But I thought about it and I said, I don't want her to interpret that too much, either my action or the donor's action.
That's very interesting. Anything you would like to add to this, Josh?
I want to just really reinforce what Kara said about educating donors. I think sometimes it can feel worrying or hard to educate a donor, but there is a conversation to be had there, especially as more and more people are looking to support journalism. We're seeing newer donors and foundations come into this space, and I think that there's a really legitimate conversation to have up front about like, we're so excited to work with you. Here's how funding journalism works. And this is based on XYZ. And we can point, and there's links that we've already shared, but other things that we can share with you all to equip you to point to like best funder practices, the Media Impact Funders website, other sorts of things, so that they realize that their peers are doing it a certain way and that they should do it that way too. And that is a conversation that you can have and even potentially have in whatever grant agreement you have. You can ask for an editorial clause that ensures that sort of independence. And I think that, there's also, I think a question about after the fact. Like sometimes you get a great grant, you have a great relationship with someone for 3 years, and then you do a story on the car dealership down the street, and that car dealership owner goes to your board member and complains, and all of a sudden you're hearing from your board member in a way you've never a donor. I'm sorry, a donor you've never heard before, right? And just being able to say to them, look, I understand how you're coming to me and you're upset about this. You don't want me to change my coverage because of your input, because you wouldn't want me to change my coverage some other way because of some other donor's input. Journalism works because of the independence and the trust that we have. And just like you wouldn't want some other donor you disagree with buying our coverage or pressuring us, you don't want to do that to us either. And that's, you invested in us because you can trust us and to be able to have that kind of conversation.
Josh, I really want to build on that if I could quickly. So one of the things that the editor who's been here a long time said to me when I first started around this conversation, he's like, you don't want to know what's going on in the newsroom because you want deniability, basically. So there's going to be articles that are going to piss people off. And I need to be able to say, I don't know what the newsroom is working on. I don't have any pre-publication view. Because if I did, then every time they annoy somebody, like I have to take that heat from a donor or whatever. And I think board members also don't want to be responsible in that way, as if they're like, have some oversight. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I say, yeah, well, they're a journalist. They're doing what they do. That's what reporters do. That's what they're supposed to be doing. So I think that it's a two-way street. We talk about it mostly like protecting the journalists, but I think there's equal need to protect board members, publisher, the fundraiser, whoever.
I got a message in the chat here, and I'm not sure how the person wants to be identified. I assume that this is not for attribution, so I'll just read the comment. The cost of a pushy donor must include the significant cost of depressed staff morale. Nothing annoys your journalists more than feeling you value donor money over their journalistic integrity, and the overall hit to the institution's reputation in the eyes of other donors, potential sources, and future employees. So that seems like a pretty worthwhile message to keep in mind as well. At this point, I think that we would love to hear some of the questions that have been coming in over the chat. And my research and podcast partner and co-author, Ellen Clegg, is going to help manage that.
So thank you, everybody, and thank you for questions. Here's one from Kristen Wainwright to Joe. Joe, how do you articulate the value of Commonwealth Beacon to the state and to the funders?
Well, good question. And I'm working on it. I'm learning how to do it. I think that, look, one of the things about Massachusetts is we are pretty much a one-party state, and that results in a perception by many people that there isn't full accountability with our state government always, and that the media plays a really important role in doing that because there aren't the usual pressures of two parties. So sometimes I talk about that our journalism, by covering them, letting people know what's going on in the State House, kind of keeps legislators on their toes. They know that what they're doing is people are gonna find out about it. Now, we don't report on everything that happens, but the legislators and policymakers don't know what we're gonna report on and whatnot. So they have to be, mindful of that all of the time. The other way we talk about it is, that an informed public can more effectively participate in their democracy. So we think about it sort of two ways, like informing the public so they can participate in their government, and holding the policymakers and decision makers accountable by making sure people know what they're doing. I think we have some work to do at Commonwealth Beacon to better connect that sort of theory of change all the way through. And we've been talking about that a little bit. And then the other way I sometimes talk about, and I actually learned this from a colleague at another statewide news organization, is we have sort of a theory of the case, which you can either believe or not believe, but that better policy will result with more information. And you could argue that's not actually true. More information won't necessarily result in better policy, but in the main, on average, over time, that's something that we believe at MassInc. And so by having more information, more facts, more evidence, more data, more stories from more places in the public domain, we think that will, over time, result in better public policy.
Irene Segi asks, Josh, you mentioned that governance problems have led to the demise of good organizations. Can you tell us more? What kind of governance problems? What happened?
Yeah, there's many examples, but I would say that maybe I'll lump two together and sort of talk about those. One, I think, is the fiduciary responsibility and financial management, and board members who aren't prepared or trained to really understand the budget scenarios, and how the money is flowing through an organization, and to really be a partner with the executive director or CEO to help them do annual planning and budgeting and that sort of thing. I've seen that really go south, and have the sort of the financial planning that's really kind of undermined the organization, and led to really, really difficult decisions. The other one that I would say is a board who, much like I love the comment that somebody said about the morale of the staff when a pushy donor gets their way. I would say also, when board members are meddling or getting involved in ways that they shouldn't, or are not getting involved. So if you have a leader of an organization who is who is creating cultural issues inside the organization, or is has growth areas that aren't being addressed by a board, that can really create rot in the organization. That it's really a board's job to be attending to the performance of the CEO or leader. And I've seen boards really coddle or ignore really bad toxic leaders, and that's just eroded the entire organization. So those are just two examples.
Tara, you run a much smaller organization than Commonwealth Beacon. I'm wondering how some of those issues play out at Santa Cruz Local.
Um, Specifically, which,
Well, the toxic culture, is that something that you've had to take?
oh,
Is that something you've had to take action to, prevent it from happening or to take the
um,
situation and prevent it from getting out of hand?
I feel very lucky that we have such an engaged board. Um, so I co-founded the company and brought it through this transition into nonprofit, which means that I got to recruit and, choose our board. We have a super amazing board, like fundraising board. They're all very engaged and have helped me think. Um, they've helped me think more boldly. They've helped me they've pushed me and encouraged me to build a strategic plan that's really sharpened our vision. It's like our fundraising has steadily increased over the past 2 years, and we're set to projected to almost double our revenue in this next year. All thanks to our board. So I think we have the opposite, the very opposite things. I feel very lucky to have such a supportive board.
Yeah, and I would just say I have seen when people have good boards, they can bring an organization through crisis in ways that are amazing to see. And so, there was just the Gene Radowski, who leads or has used to lead Resolve Philly, went through a incredibly difficult year last year, and talked recently at the Knight Media Forum about how instrumental her board was in helping her navigate that at every step of the way. And so that's the flip side, is that good boards can bring you through things that you might not even believe you can survive yourself, but then they get you through it together.
There's been a request for contact information for the panelists. So if you don't mind, if you can enter that into the chat, that would be great. Um, do we have an audience question, Ellen?
Yeah, John Collins asks, I'm interested in hearing more about the current climate of state repression in the US and the implications this may have for boards as well as donors who want to support good journalism and protect free speech.
Well, I'll start. I mean, so I guess one thing I've been trying to figure out is there a way to message around that to help raise more money? To be blunt, we're talking about donors. Is the current context something that's going to motivate some people to want to give to journalism more than maybe they have in the past because they see the importance? That's one thing. Second thing we did is we learned about and then reached out to Lawyers for Reporters, which is a nonprofit organization. I think they're based in New York City, but working nationally, that provides support to nonprofit newsrooms. And we have an engagement letter now with them, and they are providing us with pro bono legal support. So everything from helping us with our insurance, looking at our insurance policy to make sure we have the right one, to pre-publication review of articles that might be delicate. So we were motivated to do that.
Joe,
Here's a question for Kara from Kristen Wainwright. Many active citizens who make excellent board members defer when asked about fundraising. What are the radar signs for fundraisers?
So at Santa Cruz Local, our board is like they've all brought in um, other major donors. They've all also given at high levels. Some of the signs that told me that they would be great fundraisers. I mean, both two have been professional fundraisers, one at the university and the other at the Skoll Foundation and Packard. The other is the third board member is, Santa Cruz is a place with a high wealth disparity. Like we have some of the poorest communities and some of the very richest communities. We're about 40-minute drive from Silicon Valley. So there's an incredible density of wealth in the city of Santa Cruz. And it's, you can throw a rock and hit a millionaire here. I mean, like being able to tap into networks through our board has been really helped us with major giving. And I would say like with the Tiny News Board, not everyone has contributed to fundraising, but like even me, I mean, I don't think of I guess I am. I'm not like a typical fundraising board member. I don't have deep pockets of personal wealth or a personal network outside of my professional contacts. But I've sat in on many like grant conversations through Tiny News. I'm willing to put in my time, even though I don't. So I guess you're looking for people who either have resources of personal wealth, resources of like their own networks that they're willing to connect you to, or like a willingness of time to donate their time to advocate for the organization.
Well said. Yeah.
And a question from Ann Driscoll. Any advice for board presidents about what makes for strong ethical leadership?
Well, I'm going to use that question to make a couple of points I've been trying to make. I think, it goes a little bit back to culture. So obviously the board chair or president, whatever you call the person, has to exemplify all the good practices that we've talked about today, and how they behave, and maybe even look for opportunities to do that visibly. So one thing that I don't think we've touched on quite enough yet is transparency. I think that, Dan, you were very clear at the beginning, revealing that you're on the advisory board of Commonwealth Beacon. I don't think too many people are like, oh my God, now Dan's just going to throw softballs at Joe, But, in the interest of transparency, you shared that. And I think a board chair can be really clear about that. I do think transparency is a funny thing when it comes to donors, though, because, we list all our donors on our website per INN recommendations, which means all of my reporters know who our donors are. And, sometimes it's sort of this weird thing, like if we tell them who the donors are, is there an implicit suggestion with that information? And yet, if they write an article and talk about one of our big donors and don't acknowledge that conflict, then they could get sort of in trouble for that. But if I make sure they know about the donor, there is some dynamic there on transparency that is complicated. And the other thing I think that a board
Joe, I'm gonna interrupt for a second,
Sure.
because what I want to ask you is, I sometimes think that we get a little bit too hung up on the differences between nonprofit and for-profit. And certainly your reporters would know who all the advertisers are if it was a for-profit publication.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, and so I think transparency is the right answer, but I think that doesn't totally eliminate the potential for a reporter being influenced by that. But the other thing I was going to say is that we focus a lot on family relationships and financial relationships when looking for conflicts of interest, and for obvious reasons. But those aren't the only potential things that could undermine editorial independence. And so again, I think you just be friends with somebody, or your reporter might want to maintain access, so they go that influences how they might cover a topic. So I think acknowledging that there are other things to be mindful of, or just all of our inherent biases about how we look at the world and how we think about it. I think we need to be kind of honest with ourselves and transparent with ourselves and others that there are other things that shape the independence or non-independence of our journalism besides family relationships and financial relationships that can be documented on a conflict of interest form.
Here's one from Sandy. Speaking of advertising, are there ethical issues with advertising exclusivity?
Ellen, do you have a sense as to what she means by advertising exclusivity? Because I saw that going by in the chat and I was a little puzzled.
Beyond, no, I don't.
Sandy, if you're there, you might type something in the chat to add to that.
One thing that I've seen, and I've seen this both in for-profit and nonprofit in terms of like sometimes this shows up as sponsorships or underwriting, but the idea that if you can be the exclusive car dealership advertising in our publication or or underwriting our journalism content, that like there's a privileged position that you're giving an advertiser or a sponsor or underwriter to help seal the deal or to get them to up their gift. We won't let any other car dealerships advertise, right? And I think that one of the things that we do sometimes is we separate advertisers from donors. And I actually think that across foreign nonprofit media, there are ethical issues. Like any of this stuff can be done unethically. I don't know that an exclusivity advertising arrangement like that is in and of itself unethical. If it is then saying, and we'll also cover the next Ford Mustang that comes out on your lot, or so, like then obviously we're starting to get into muddy waters. But I think any of these things, from donors to advertising to sponsorships to underwriting to sponsored content, etc., can be done poorly. And there are some fairly good guides across these different kinds of revenue strategies for how to structure them in a way that kind of upholds independence and ethics.
Yeah, and Sandy says that's it. You've nailed it.
We ran into this once. We were approached by a company that wanted to sponsor an event on a topic, and the topic involved the industry in which this company worked. And we went around in like 25 circles and ultimately didn't do the event. And it was a mutual agreement that there was no way to have them sponsor the event, and they were just too intertwined with that issue. But I wouldn't say I would never do an event on energy and have it be sponsored by an energy company. I wouldn't draw an absolute rule on that. One thing, with funding is, the more diverse your funding, the less dependent you are on any one funder, the less influence any one funder has. That's true for board members too, by the way. A larger board, kind of dilutes the influence of any one player. But funding diversity is really key, both for the perception and the reality of undue influence.
NJ Spotlight News, which is one of the projects that Alan and I wrote about in our book, does regular Zoom events on various public policy issues. And they're always sponsored by lobbying groups and the like that are directly involved in those issues. And it is a little uncomfortable, isn't it? But what they'll tell you is it's a matter of trust. We emphasize our independence. We just hope that our readers and viewers understand that. And it's an important source of revenue for them.
Yeah, Dan, I wanted to ask further on the panelists. Events are an all hands on deck matter especially for a small organization. And So how do you assure that everybody has their own, stays in their own lane, and that the content side and the business side can work together, but to create an event, but maintain independence?
We are doing leaning more and more into events this year. We uh, we we have this North Star of civic engagement. Like we're really trying to get Santa Cruz County and Pajaro Valley residents informed, engaged, and joining in civic life. And we know that events are the quickest way to get people from reading on their screen to action. Um, we set up our events team is a subset of our larger team. Our reporters aren't involved in putting on the event. It's me, our community engagement manager, and our we hired like an events consultant. I and the events consultant are also trying to sell sponsorships to fund these events. This is kind of an experiment for us to see if events sponsorship can be a viable revenue stream for us. Our metric of success is if we can double, if our event revenue can double the event expenses to fund our journalism, then we know it's worthwhile. We haven't yet faced, nothing has felt ethically sticky to me yet. I think it's, yeah, helpful having like a sub team doing a sort of like a sprint experiment. But yeah, I haven't found any gray areas yet.
Here's a question from Peggy. How do you see Press Forward influencing the local news ecosystem?
I can take a first stab at that. I'm on the Press Forward Management Committee, so that's my disclosure. Um, and I think that one of the reasons why the group of funders who came together to try to launch Press Forward did so was because we were trying to influence the funding community in large part and radically grow the number of funders who were supporting journalism by trying to set out a easier pathways for them to do so. But we also wanted Press Forward to fund in ways and places that other donors had ignored. So we were interested in philanthropy. You might say philanthropy deserts. We talk about news deserts a lot, but philanthropy deserts, both places where funders haven't been giving, but also modes of giving that funders hadn't been giving. So the first open call for Press Forward had 200 newsrooms who were given grants, and the Press Forward funders chose to really focus on smaller newsrooms because we understood and heard from those newsrooms that those newsrooms had a really hard time accessing funders and philanthropic resources. Now, anytime you get a group of funders together and anytime you create a big campaign, you're going to create sort of waves and ripples in the field. So Press Forward does take a stand on some things that it thinks are essential in the local news landscape. One is that independence piece that we've been talking about from the start. Another piece is equity and the urgent, demand that our newsrooms better reflect the communities that we serve. Another one is that public policy has a role to play, which I think is not something that all journalists agree on, but Press Forward really believes that if we are going to have a overall news landscape that supports our democracy, that non-commercial and public funded revenue sources are going to be a part of that solution. And then finally, we believe that the we have to build an infrastructure for independent media in America that, all of the things that used to be baked into the big newsrooms aren't things that small newsrooms can access or build themselves. Not everyone's going to have a general counsel, so we need lawyers for reporters. Not everyone's going to be able to build their own membership software, so we need the News Revenue Hub, etc. And so in taking a stand on some of those things, Press Forward recognizes that it is going to influence both the local news field around some of those issues and the donors. And so that was an intentional choice that we wanted to kind of put our flag in the ground on some of those issues. And I think that, it's still pretty early on. But my hope is that it can really bring. Oh, I would say the last thing that Press Forward believes is that local people should really be driving this forward. And so we've had, 36 local chapters started with local funders and donors. And we think that that is a really key part of the solution, that local people be at the driver's seat for how we're supporting local news. So uh, those are just some of the ways that I think that Press Forward may be influencing the overall landscape.
We
And
are, we
final
are
question.
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ellen.
A question from Zachary. How do you balance the need for speed and immediacy with the imperative for accuracy and ethical reporting? Do you feel like you have the room to ensure these aspects in your newsroom's reporting while balancing boards and readers' expectations, especially with smaller outfits?
Well, I mean, that's certainly a challenge. We have a daily newsletter, and it is a pressure on this team every day. And, we're constantly trying to navigate, the quick story that can be out in the next morning's newsletter versus the deeper research piece, which may take, weeks. And we have such a small team, you can't have one reporter just gone for 3 weeks working on one story. So, I mean, that's for the newsroom to figure out, not me. But it is a real tension. And, but I think I do want to just flag one thing we didn't talk about, which is trust in news and the perception by a lot of the public that journalists are biased. And I don't think it's because of how we are funded or because of conflict of interest on our board. I think there's just a wide perception that a lot of news organizations have either a liberal or a conservative bias. And so I think we should put a lot of attention on these issues of conflicts and money, but we should also remember there's another form of independence or lack thereof that is out there that is really impacting our sector in a deep way that goes far beyond some of the issues we talked about today. Maybe that's another topic for another night, Dan. But at the first conference I went to in journalism, I had dozens of conversations about this stuff, and nobody was talking about the other issue, and I found it really strange.
Interesting. Any further thoughts, Kara and Josh, on trust?
I would say the antidote to that is starting with listening, trying to build relationships, and responding to what the people you serve are asking for.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would say rooting journalism in people's lived experiences. And if you want to see a good example of that, go to the Santa Cruz Locals website and check out their resources. What Kara has done there with the team to provide journalism as a service to people and to people's daily lives and the concerns that they have is really commendable.
Thanks,
So
Josh.
anyway, I want to be respectful of our panelists' time. We're a few minutes over. So with that, I want to thank our great panelists, Josh Stearns, Kara Myberg Guzman, Joe Kreisberg, and thanks to Ellen Clegg for all of your help in managing the conversation. And thanks to all of you for attending. Now, we're going to be posting the video. And we're going to include a list of nonprofit resources that Josh provided to us. Also, please stay tuned for more information about an in-person What Works conference that we're planning to have this fall. It is tentatively scheduled for Friday, October 17th. So you can put it on your calendar. So thank you so much to everybody. I really appreciate your coming. I think that we got a lot to think about from our panelists, and I hope you all have a good night.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
all.
Well, oh, Joe left. Well, you were all, oh, and Kara left. Well, Josh, you, Kara, and Joe were spectacular. So thank you so much.
Great questions from everybody. I'm glad I could be here and happy to, keep following up via email if anyone needs to.
Okay.
Right.
I think with that, we will end the meeting.
Okay.
So take care, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Alan. Back to editing.